are murderers who at first sight arouse confidence and even sympathy. When they get to know their victims, they don't even think that something bad can happen because these killers have charming smiles and warm looks and are polite and cultural. But all this is just a game, a mask that is meant to cover up the real face, and it's full of psychopathic fantasies that make the killer look at another person as a victim, an object, not a living, feeling being. Such murderers are the most dangerous because they can pretend so perfectly that no one even for a fraction of a second suspects that there is darkness behind that nice sight. So was Ted Bundy, and so was Jeffrey Dahmer. But some murderers already appear to be anxious and distant, and then the question arises, how is it possible that such a person attracted victims, and those trusted fell straight into this spider network? The killer I'm going to tell you about today was incredibly cunning. He didn't make a smile, but he had a different weapon. It was his intelligence. He knew perfectly well how to manipulate the environment, to such an extent that he even became a good friend of the cops. Those people admitted, I like him, I like Ed Kemper. Meet the murderer and the necrophile. The man who hated women and who defiled them so brutally that the press wrote, too disgusting to be true. But it was true. Ed Kemper inflicted unimaginable pain and suffering on 10 people, including his own family. Kemper could have scared you. He was 206 centimeters tall and weighed over 130 kilograms. But he knew how and what to tell people to mask his physical strength with a confident character. He was also able to suppress his emotions, but his mother had a big influence on it. Kemper's childhood was not a happy one, and it can be said that to a large extent, it was what shaped him, and it caused Ed to burn an unprecedented hatred and contempt for women. So before we go into Kemper's bloody activities, I'm going to take you on a journey back to the past, to the moments that made Ed a serial killer. Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank. Edmund, later called Edim, was a grown-up child. If you believe the information on the internet, he weighed 6 kilograms. His father was a World War II veteran. He had a good relationship with his son, at least in his first years of life, because when Kemper was 9, his parents decided to divorce. For the boy, it was the greatest tragedy he could have imagined at the time. His father, whom he loved and admired, suddenly disappeared from his life. He was for it with his mother, who was an extremely toxic woman and also abused alcohol. She also had a big problem with accepting her son, already after his arrest. In a TV interview for the film No Apparent Motive, Ed talked about his mother.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry and very sad woman. I hated her, but at the same time I wanted to love her.
The woman had such a problem with her son that she locked him in the basement for the night. She was afraid she would her own sisters. Ed repeatedly mentioned that the lonely nights in the closet were a real nightmare for him. He hurt a guy under the rat, and because of this, he felt rejected and unloved. And I think it's hard to be surprised at these feelings, because would a loving mother commit such cruel educational methods to her own child? I think everyone knows what the answer should be. The lack of support and care on the part of his mother, and the lack of the pattern of masculinity that the young boys identify with their father, made Ed show very disturbing behavior as a child. They manifested themselves in unprecedented cruelty. He killed animals, which he later buried, cut them into pieces, and beat them with a sharp fire. In this way he killed the cat. He also took the life of the family dog. Reason: he showed his interest in Kemper's sister, not in him. The boy also liked the brutal games with dolls. He took them from his younger sister, Eileen, and then stripped them of their heads and limbs. He also wanted his brothers and sisters to bust him. He pretended to be executed soon. As an adult man, he mentioned that he had been close to death twice in his childhood. The older sister tried to push him under the train, and sometime later she threw him into the pool, where Kemper almost drowned. An attentive parent would immediately notice all these cruel games of his child, but not Kemper's mother. Her relationship was getting worse and worse. So much so that Ed ran away from her when he was 15. He wanted to live with his father. But he already had a new family and there was no room for a troubled teenager. That was another blow for the boy. But he didn't want to go back to his toxic mother, so he was sent back to his grandparents. They were the parents of Ed's father. The boy hated this place. He felt bad about him as if he was still with his own mother. And then he committed his first crime. During the fight, he grabbed a gun and shot his own grandmother. He fired his first shot in the head. Two more were hit in the back. When the grandfather entered the house from shopping, the boy also shot him. As he later explained, he did so that the man didn't have to look at his murdered wife. It was supposed to be an expression of a certain grace that he directed to him. He wanted to spare his suffering. Teen Kemper himself called the police. He said what he did. As he later explained to the officers, the murder was meant to test his feelings. He wanted to know what it was like to take his own grandmother's life. Because he was a minor, he did not go to prison for his crime. However, he was referred to psychiatric treatment because he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Kemper was admitted to the state hospital. He quickly gained allies there. He was already capable of perfectly manipulating the environment. He was incredibly intelligent, so he knew what to do and how to get psychiatrists to look at him with a more kind eye. He behaved impeccably, fulfilling his duties accurately. There was no problem with him. He proved to be so intelligent at the time that he even deceived the entire medical system. He was undergoing psychological tests, spending his time alone. He learned to remember some of them. That made him translate them flawlessly. He was happy because he manipulated the environment. The surroundings were happy because they lived in the belief that Kemper's resocialization was almost exemplary. Without a doubt, the doctors fixed his release with the words, "He's all right." Kemper was released on his 21st birthday. The murder rate began 3 years later. Despite his instructions, Ed returned to his mother. She's already had time to restore her life, at least for a while. She married again, divorced again after some time. Living with a woman wasn't easy. Although Kemper was already an adult, young man, all the traumatic stories of childhood have not passed. There was a constant riot between the two, so the mood at home was very tense. Kemper's mother got a job at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was an administrative worker there. In later years, this post greatly facilitated Ed's access to young women he could have killed. But before that happened, the man once again cheated the system. Further inspections showed that it no longer poses any danger to the environment. The murder he committed as a minor disappeared from the system. All the psychiatric tests he passed were targeted, and his last opinion about his psychic was as follows. I believe that years of treatment have produced excellent results and, from a psychiatric point of view, I see no reason to see a patient as a threat to himself or to any other member of society, because thanks to this, as an adult, you will gain more freedom and opportunities to develop your potential. It seems reasonable to completely blur the record of acts committed in youth. Kemper's case is probably one of the greatest mistakes in the history of psychiatry. The crimes he later committed were a denial of any humanity and a confirmation that not only should Kemper never finish his treatment, but he should never be released. Meanwhile, Ed was able to enjoy that freedom again. He even tried to some extent to get back into society. He wanted to get to the police. However, he was not accepted into the service, which hurt him quite badly. But he didn't break. He took on various activities to make money and put some money away. This allowed him to move out of the house and partly cut off from his toxic mother. Unfortunately, he could not completely disconnect because a woman was harassing him with phones. Sometimes a man came back to her when he had lost his job or had no money, at any cost. However, he wanted to isolate himself and settle down. He even tried to create the appearance of a normal relationship. He even got engaged to a 16-year-old girl, but it didn't stand the test of time. Kemper himself spoke of himself.
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially and sexually. I was emotionally impotent. I was deadly frightened by the failure of relationships with women. I didn't know anything about this whole emotional sphere. even when I was just sitting and talking to a young woman. That's why I started taking pedestrians, and young pedestrian girls.
This caused his frustration to grow, and it has been so deeply hidden for all these years. He was fantasizing about killing again, and that desire finally had to take over. Kemper was not under the care of any institution. He had no support from his family. He was alone with his thoughts that dominated his life. I'm not saying that if he got help, those fantasies would just fade away. But you couldn't allow it to operate amongst people without supervision. The explosion of his fantasies and suppressed emotions occurred in 1972. Kemper began to chase up strange girls who were unconsciously entering his car. There was a sticker on the vehicle that allowed you to enter the campus. This is, of course, thanks to Ida's mother, who worked there. Such a sticker made the girls, who decided on the floor, feel safe. They were convinced that nothing threatened them, and they ended up with someone who was connected to their university. Kemper did not raise any suspicions, and he was sympathetic and discreet. You have to know that he was also over-average intelligent. In the psychiatric clinic, his IQ was 130, but according to some experts, his intelligence rate was even higher, at least 145, a beast with an outstanding mind. In 1970, Kemper was finally able to realize his fantasies. On the 7th of May, on his way, he met Marion and Anita, two students. He promised to take them to Stanford University, but they didn't get there. Instead, it drove the girls further and further and more and more.
We were going to isolated places where I could act, where nobody was watching, and nobody could say no to me. I had a hidden gun in the car. It deepened my strange feeling that devoured me from the inside. Those fantastic cravings. She took over me. She was like a drug, like alcohol. At first, small doses were enough, but over time I wanted more and more until I finally dared to pull out the weapon. And when I pulled it out, it was obvious that something was going to happen. I didn't know where it would take me at the time, but I felt something big was about to happen. I played a dangerous game with my partners.
Kemper initially wanted the students, but later he recalled the words of his colleagues at the factory where he was. They told him never to leave witnesses, so he knew what he had to do. First, he killed Anita, then he came back for a friend.
I remember that horrible incident with her roommate, with her strangling. I was shocked that this was going on, but it was like a trance. I had to catch her. I couldn't let her go because she'd tell everybody. Everybody's gonna catch me. She saw blood on my hands. She asked me, "What are you doing?" She got famous, she cried. And I didn't want her to know what happened. I said I had a fight with her friend. I didn't hit. I killed, but I never hit. I said, "We had a fight and I hit your girlfriend in the nose. Come on, help me." I said that because I didn't want her to know I was going to kill her. I didn't have the courage to tell her that outright. When I attacked her, she didn't even realize what was going on. I threw her into the car. I had such a big butcher's knife. I started choking her until I pushed her into the trunk.
This murder brought Kemper a lot of unbelievable emotions, but there was panic. As he said, he abandoned his victims for a moment and began to run ahead of him. But then he stopped, took his breath, and said to himself, "Think logically." When he cooled, he went back into the car. Both students were in the trunk. Interestingly, when he was driving to his apartment, which he then rented with a colleague, he was arrested by the police. His backlight didn't work. Doesn't that remind you of anything? In this episode, I told you about Jeffrey Dahmer, a cannibal from Milwaukee. He was also detained for police inspection after one of the murders. He had the bodies of his previously killed colleague in his car. And then the cops didn't look and check what was in the bag either. They let him go. In the following years, Dahmer killed 16 young boys and men. It was the same with Kemper. If only the cop had looked into the trunk, he would have seen the bodies of two student women brutally murdered. But that didn't happen, and Kemper, well, started his bloody raid through California. After the police did not check the car, Kemper returned to his apartment. There was no co-locator, so he brought the bodies of the girls inside. That's where he took pictures of them, and then robbed them. He put the pieces of the bodies in plastic bags. He threw their heads into a mountain pit. In August of the same year, Mary Ann's skull was found near the Loma Prieta mountain. However, the remaining parts of the body were unable to be localized. In September 1972, Kemper met Aiko Ko, a beautiful 15-year-old girl with Latvian Korean roots. The man offered her a truck. And since the teenager was already late for dance lessons, she agreed and got into Kemper's car, not knowing that it would be her last trip in her life. Ed did the same thing here as he did his first victims. He took Aiko to a distant place so they could be alone. He stifled her, and then killed her. He threw the body into the trunk and left. On the way, he stopped at the bar to have a few drinks. Then he went back into the car and, carrying the girl's body in the middle, he moved towards the house. And again, he brought the body inside, sexually abused it, twisted it, and threw it away. Hundreds of photos of a missing girl appeared in the area. The mother still hoped that her daughter would find herself healthy and healthy. Hanging more pictures on the walls, she didn't think her baby would ever come back to her. Kemper aroused an incredible desire. Finally, he found a way to interact with women. They didn't embarrass him anymore, and he could do whatever he liked with them. He was becoming more and more brutal, using the bodies in every way. He was proud of what he left behind. He was thrilled by the brutality and authority over the victims. That's the only way he could get into any male-female relationship. He was intoxicated by the fragmentation of bodies, especially the cut-off of heads. His next victim was 18-year-old Cindy. She got into his car on January 7, 1973. Then he lived with his mother again. He took the girl out to the woods and shot her there. Then he took the bodies and hid them in the closet. The body was lying there all night. It wasn't until the man's mother came to work that Kemper used the bodies, whistled, and cut off his head, and he did it all in his mother's bath. Interestingly, he stopped the teenager's head. After his arrest, he was convinced that the head cut was related to his childhood.
It's about my childhood. I remember my dad cut off the heads of the chickens, and my mom gave them to the family for dinner. My father used to do it with a special hatch, which I stole, got on a bicycle, and rode around the area. I didn't tell anyone about it, but I think that's when I started to combine these issues in my fantasies. Heads and cutting them off.
After some time, the head of the teenager buried in the garden faced to the mother's window. As he explained, the woman always liked when someone looked at her, so the victim's eyes were aimed at her. Only a month later, Ed went hunting again. This quick hunt was the result of a previous quarrel with my mother. The man was circling around the area looking for more victims. Already then, the media was about a murderer who attacked a student girl. Young girls were advised not to get into the car with a stranger, but Kemper wasn't a stranger to the student girls because he still had the university sticker on the car. Therefore, despite investigations and appeals, the girls continued to get into his car. So he didn't have to wait for the next victims. On February 5, 1973, he offered Rosalind, 23, and Alice, 20, a ride to the university campus. This time he killed the victims with a gun. He shot them out of a .22 caliber gun. He wrapped the bodies in a cage, hid them in a car, and took them to his mother's house. He cut off the victim's head in the car. He threw the squared bodies in the Eden Canyon. The end of his murderous activity, however, was slowly approaching. And it's not because the police got him on his heels. Officers were far from identifying the perpetrator. None of them even suspected Kemper himself. After he was not recruited, Ed began to go to the bar, where the cops also arrived. He talked to them. He was kidding. They themselves later admitted that they really liked him. He would probably be the last person to be suspected of such brutal crimes. On April 20th, 1973, something happened that completely changed the course of events. Ida's mother had a party that day. When she came back, she fought a little with her son, and then she went to bed. and that's all Kemper was waiting for. When the woman was completely unaware of what was going on around her, had entered her bedroom and accomplished what he had long dreamed of. With a cesial hammer, he massacred a woman, cut her throat, and then cut off her head. He cut off her tongue and her throat, for as he spoke, he was tired of her screaming. Although he admitted that even after his death he had the impression that she was still screaming. Did he feel relieved? Probably. He hated his mother, even though, as he persuaded, he tried to love her. When he mentioned a woman after years in a television interview, even tears flowed down his cheeks. But it's hard to judge whether they were real or were another murderer's manipulation. After Kemper's mother was murdered, he hid her body in the closet and went for a drink. Then he brought home a friend of the murdered mother. He convinced Sally that he was planning a dinner together. When the woman came to the scene, he choked her and cut her head off again. The next day he cleaned the house thoroughly and left a note to the police. His content was quite abstract, given the crime he committed. He wrote about 5:15 a.m. on Saturday, in the hands of a murderous butcher. She didn't suffer long. It happened quickly, in a dream, as I planned. The action was planned and it went well, gentlemen. I don't have any more time. I'm busy. Imagine minds of cops reading these words. Kemper himself headed for Pueblo in sunny Colorado. He's driven 1,300 kilometers, and he waited. He was confident that the pursuit would soon begin, and the media would flood the details of the brutal murder of two women. But there was silence instead of publicity. Ed understood that no one was looking for him. There's no police blockade, no exciting journalism. There was silence. Kemper decided he'd wait any longer. He went to the telephone booth and called the police. He told me who he was and what he did. But the officer he was talking to didn't believe his story. He ignored him. Ed called again a few hours later. He was linked to a cop he knew personally. Kemper repeated his story. He also revealed his location and waited for the cops. Meanwhile, officers came to his house. They searched the building. When they picked up the mattress from the bed, it was literally filled with blood, and they found the bodies in the closet. They also read the letter left by the killer. They admitted they had never seen anything like this before. Kemper had already confessed to the murder of 6 young women, as well as his mother and her friend. When asked why he gave up, he replied that he had achieved his most important goal. There was no point in continuing. It was, as he said, a waste of time. So he said, and that's why he confessed. Ed Kemper's trial began in May 1973. He was charged with 8 murders. The man confessed to everything. He told about his crimes in the smallest detail. He didn't hide anything. However, he wanted to deceive the judiciary once again. His lawyer applied for acquittal on the grounds of impunity. Ed probably thought that if he managed to do this after killing his grandparents, he'd still be able to convince him that it was actually a mental illness that ordered him to commit all these murders. While in custody, he tried to take his life twice. The trial was therefore interrupted. It was resumed in October of the same year. Despite the efforts of Kemper and his lawyer, they found the man readable at the time of the murders. One of the psychiatrists was supposed to have admitted cannibalism. Later, however, he withdrew from these words. During the trial, Kemper admitted that he killed women because he wanted to have power over them. He wanted to fully control them, to meet his needs. To be honest, he wanted to do everything he could never afford to do with living women. He convinced me that he couldn't control it, and he killed at a time of temporary darkness, but these translations were worthless. On November 8, 1973, a jury found Kemper fully justified and guilty of all the crimes he was accused of, and had asked for the death penalty. He wanted it to be executed through torture, but it was at that time that the death penalty in California was suspended, and he was sentenced to 7 life sentences. Kemper was sent to the same prison where Charles Manson, the leader of the sect that murdered the pregnant Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski's wife, and her friends, was sentenced. Interestingly, Ed despised Manson. There were no complaints about Kemper during his sentence. He was an exemplary prisoner. Just like when he went to a psychiatric clinic after his grandmother and grandfather were murdered. He made ceramic vessels, was a lecturer of audiobooks for the blind, and spent more than 5,000 hours in the studio. He did that until 2015. Then his work was hampered by the spill that he passed. During the years of his detention, Kemper sought conditional release on several occasions. The last time he did that was in 2017. All his proposals, however, were rejected. He himself stated that society is simply not ready for his return. Several interviews were conducted with him in prison. Each of them is an excellent material for psychiatrists and behaviorists. With his sincerity and his words, you can dig into the mind of a psychopath, even if he only lets the recipient into one of the many hidden corners there. Ed Kemper has become one of the most famous serial killers in history. He also entered the pop culture. He was one of many inspirations for the creation of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Sheep. He also appeared in several tracks, including the System Group Down. Kemper became loud again when his character was reproduced with great accuracy in the series Mindhunter, about FBI agents investigating the minds of serial killers. Ed is still in jail, where he'll spend the rest of his life. He is 73 years old and will be able to apply for conditional release again in 2024. Although, as he himself said, he had already accepted that prison was the last stop in his life.